It's really a great honor for me to be here, and be in conversation, spending this morning talking about how to use culturally relevant science communication to bring your full selves into science, to share your stories in science, to engage communities. All right, and I want to start with a question. What makes you feel connected to science? What makes science meaningful to you? And I'll take responses and I'll just repeat them for the benefit of everyone. What makes you feel connected to science? What makes science meaningful to you? Your blood. Curiosity. Results. Finding cool stuff. Let's see, one more. Do I have one more? If I do, I can't hear you. All right, so thank you for sharing. So I'm gonna tell you some of the things that make me feel connected to science. The beach, lizards, cows, and the elders that I grew up with that knew more about plants and animals than really anyone with a PhD I've ever met. And all of these things are, of course, connected to Puerto Rico, where I was born and raised. Now, why am I telling you this? Well, because culture, our experiences, our identities, our values, our previous knowledge, all of those things, they influence our interest and our approaches to science. And I was born and raised in a rural working class community with a cow in my backyard. That is me and my cow. Her name was Carla. And being surrounded by nature was really what got me interested in science, particularly in biology, but I didn't know that I could be a scientist. This wasn't an option to me. Because when I saw science in TV, books, anywhere around me, scientists and science looked like this. This is a show that I used to watch called Beakman's World, and not surprisingly, the scientist is a white man with crazy hair and a lab coat. He didn't look like me, his assistants didn't look like me, certainly not the rat. This show was produced in English, it was dubbed in Spanish, their Spanish was different from mine. And so what that meant is that science felt really foreign to my reality. It felt distant. And it felt like it was irrelevant to me, to what I was doing, to what I was living every day. And this is often what happens. Science is decontextualized, disconnected from the culture and experiences and of marginalized folks, and it also, science often overlooks our realities, what we do and what we know. But culturally relevant science communication, it offers a way to address this exclusion of marginalized folks. So I want to tell you a few of the key elements of culturally relevant science communication. We must consider people's culture, and so that means that we must consider their socioeconomic status, their geography, where do they live, their backgrounds, what are their different identities. We must also consider what are the languages they speak, what are the values that they hold, what are their beliefs. And we also must consider their previous knowledge. What are the things that they already know, and how can we connect science to the things that they already know? Culturally relevant science communication also requires self-awareness. It's not just about being aware of our audience's culture, we must be aware of our own culture, because us as scientists, as communicators, as whatever we do, we see the world, we see science through a cultural lens as well. We have to consider our biases and privileges. We, especially scientists, were told that science is objective, but science is done by people, and people have biases. It doesn't matter who we are, it doesn't matter how much training we have. We all have biases. We also have privileges based on the color of our skin, our gender, where we were born. And so we have to take into account those things because they affect how we see the world and how people see us. We have to recognize historical inequities. There are populations that historically have been excluded and overlooked by science. There are populations that have also been abused by science, and that influences how they see science, how they relate to it. And finally, we must have empathy and humility. Communication, fundamentally, it's about connections. It's about building a relationship with your audience. And so you need to be able to put yourself in their shoes, to think of their perspectives, to at least consider their perspectives. And we need humility because we don't know everything. We don't know, we haven't lived their realities, and so we need humility to understand those things. So why cultural relevance? Well, because of all of those things that I've mentioned. But fundamentally, because culturally relevant science communication can help us connect science with the realities, the values, and the identities of our different audiences. It also helps people make sense of the world because we look at the world through our experiences and our culture. When we make science culturally relevant for folks, it helps them make sense of science. It also makes science pertinent, more accessible, and actionable. And culturally relevant science communication can help us visualize and tell the stories of marginalized people and communities. So I want to share some strategies for culturally relevant science communication. There are many. And so I want to share some examples of those strategies from my work and the work of some of my colleagues. So the first strategy that I want to highlight is that science or culturally relevant science communication, it can help connect science to the context of an audience. So this is a maple seed tree, and it kind of has a helicopter shape. And this is a great example of how plants use the shape of their seeds to help them spread further. This is a universal biological concept. Lots of plants everywhere around the world do this. But for someone who grew up in the tropics like me, well, this is a very, very cool example. This isn't something that I saw growing up. I saw this eventually when I've moved to Boston because these trees are very, very common in North America. A more culturally relevant example for someone like me is this. This is the seed of the African tulip tree. In Puerto Rico, we call it meaito. And this is the seeds, they live in these pods, and when the pods open, hundreds of these seeds fly out because the seed is surrounded by this thin, wingy film. They kind of glide in the air. I don't know if you have these trees here, but so if you do, I see some nodding. You know, you may have seen this around, and I know that when I go home to Puerto Rico, in the summer, these are everywhere. I see them floating everywhere like snow, but better because it's not cold. And so using the African tulip as an example of seed dispersion and how the shape of seeds help them go further, it's a more culturally relevant way to share that concept with people in Puerto Rico or here or anywhere in the tropics where these trees exist. So the second strategy I want to highlight is how we can connect science to pop culture. And I'm going to share a video of a TED Talk from my friend Dr. Danielle Lee. She is an ecologist. And I'm going to let you watch the video and then we can talk through it because for me, it's really a masterclass in culturally relevant science communication.
All you'll simply need to do is revisit the song OPP by Naughty by Nature. It was released in 1991. Now, OPP is a call and response song. So throughout the talk, I'm going to put lyrics up on the screen, and I'm going to recite some, and I'm going to prompt you when it's your turn to do the response, okay? Now, I know some people in this audience know this song, so I need you to lead the way with the tempo and the rhythm, if that's all right, okay? All right, y'all ready? You down with OPP? Yeah, you know me. You down with OPP? Yeah, you know me. You down with OPP? Yeah, you know me. That was perfect. Thank you. OPP, how can I explain it? I take it frame by frame it to have y'all jumping, shouting, singing it. O is for other, P is for people, scratch your temple. The last P, well, that's not that simple. Now, in the song, the MC hints that it's a 5-letter word, but to keep it rated PG, he simply refers to it as property. The song is about cheating on your significant other. Now, around the time that this song was in heavy rotation, biologists were in deep discussion about whether bird species, notably songbirds and waterfowl, were actually monogamous or not. See, for decades, generations of science students were taught that well over 90% of the bird species were monogamous, a male and female mating faithfully for life. That was until the late 1980s, when a new laboratory technique came on the scene, which could copy DNA from a small tissue or fluid sample and decode the genetics of individuals. Now, before that technique, we were never ever certain about 100% who the parents of baby birds were. All we had were our field notes, and we would know which adults lived in the nest and which ones fed the baby birds. Well, come to find out, study after study kept coming in, and we found so much evidence of infidelity among bird species, particularly these songbirds that we thought were the pinnacle of monogamy. It would have made Maury Povich jealous for the ratings. It rocked biology and ornithology so hard, we had to modify and expand the entire definition of monogamy. Now, it was so bad that this was the headline of the New York Times science section, August 1990. Mating for life is not for the birds or bees. We had to come up with new definitions. The situation where an individual would change partners either between breeding seasons or just simply because they didn't like that partner anymore, we now call that serial monogamy. I didn't know it was going to be this funny. The situation where we know the male and female pair together and all the babies belong to both partners, we call that genetic monogamy. And we now recognize that it only holds true for about 14% of the songbird species we thought we were very certain were truly monogamous. And with this reclassification, we realized that in a lot of those field observations where we saw a male and female sharing a nest, co-maintaining a territory, even provisioning offspring together, often included a few baby birds that did not belong to the male partner. We call this social monogamy. And the mechanism responsible? Extra-pair copulation. It's OPP time for other people's what you get it. There's no room for relationship, there's just room to. Yeah. How many brothers out there know just what I'm getting at? Who think it's wrong because I was splitting and co-hitting that? Well, if you do, that's OPP. Actually, that's EPC, which is the abbreviation for extra pair copulation. Now, we define extra pair copulation as the mating outside of a pair bond. And just like we were discovering via science, it can lead to babies that don't belong to the male partner. All right? Now, I first learned about EPCs years later after all the science news broke while I was in graduate school. And as we were taking a class talking about current discoveries and mating systems, this topic comes up. And as my professor is going through the definition and recounting all the dramatic turn of events that lead to these new revelations, I'm sitting in class and a familiar song starts bopping in my head. I'm like, you know me? Yeah, you know me. I mean, that's exactly what that song was about. EPCs. And what I recognize is that this gives us an opportunity to revisit this song. Let's switch the lyrics up. So say EPC. Say it like you mean to say EPC. I like to say it with pride. Now, when you do it well and make sure that it counts. You're not down with a discount. You down with EPC? And you down with EPC? Yeah, you know me. Now, I had always been playing songs in my head while I was in science class, kind of tapping into this index of pop culture and hip hop songs. But when I would share my analogies with my science professors, all of whom are older white men, I often got blank and confused stares as responses. But when I would share this with people from communities like mine or other colleagues, so diverse communities, this hip hop science remix was a hit. That's because I was either talking to people who looked and sounded like me, or at the very least, listened to some of the same songs. We were sharing a common cultural lexicon. And with that lexicon, I was able to bring new science terms to them. And together, we were sharing a new comprehension of science for the culture. Now, hip-hop song references are a really good tool for teaching content to students from hip-hop culture or urban communities. And I use it intentionally to connect to those students, tapping into vocabulary that they already know and systems that they already comprehend. And what it does in that process is it ratifies them, us, our culture as knowledge purveyors. I use hip hop to frame and communicate science because I'm intentionally communicating science to broader audiences that public science outreach has traditionally overlooked. And in the process, I am affirming the genius that thrives in the young minds of people from every hood, everywhere. So let me ask you one last time. You down with EPC? Yeah, you know me. You down with EPC? Yeah, you know me. You down with EPC? Yeah, you know me. Who's down with EPC? All the homies. Thank you.
This talk for me is a masterclass in culturally relevant science communication. From the way that she carries herself, the way she's dressed, the way she talks, the way she raps, and how she uses this song to connect it to her communities, to people who love hip hop, how she uses it to affirm the genius of communities of color as purveyors of science knowledge. And she really uses songs like this, some things that people know, to connect them with a complex science concept like extra pair copulation. So the next strategy I want to share with you is how we can offer culturally relevant role models to people. Who's this? Albert Einstein. So when people think of a scientist or a physicist, this is often the image that pops in their heads. This is often the image that is used to say scientist. And this is fine, like Albert Einstein he made important contributions to science and people should know about him and what he did and what matters. However, it's hard, for many people to see themselves in Albert Einstein. A more culturally relevant role model for some folks would be Dr. Wanda Diaz-Merced. She is a Puerto Rican astrophysicist who also happens to be blind. Wanda lost her sight when she was an undergrad. She's an astronomer, and astronomy it tends to be a highly visual field. That didn't stop her. She actually went on for her PhD, and she created a way to sonify data. So she created a way to turn data, which fundamentally are numbers, into music. And music also uses numbers. And she now lives in South Africa, and she does science diplomacy, and she works in projects to make astronomy accessible to people like her, people who are blind. And so she's not only a living scientist, but she lives at the intersections of these different identities that represent diversity in science. And so I would argue that, sure, people need to know about Einstein, but people should also get to know Wanda. The next strategy is how to connect science to identities and values. And so I'm a multimedia producer, so I'm gonna show you another video, and then we'll talk about it. Oh, and I should say, this video is in Spanish, it's in sign language, and it's captioned in English. So for those of you that don't speak either one of those two languages, pay attention to the captions.
La pandemia de COVID-19 nos ha forzado a vivir tiempos duros, complicados y hasta desesperantes. Nuestros hogares, nuestras comunidades, nuestros corazones, nuestras mentes y nuestros bolsillos han sufrido mucho. La COVID-19 ha retado todo lo que nos hace boricuas. Juntarnos en familia y con amistades, hacer el bembé, chinchorrear y hasta darnos un abrazo. Cosas que antes eran parte de nuestra vida diaria, hoy nos ponen en riesgo de contagiarnos con el coronavirus. Pero la ciencia nos enseña que, aunque tengamos que modificar nuestros hábitos, no tenemos que perder nuestra esencia boricua. Si seguimos practicando las medidas de prevención con la estamina y el compromiso que nos distingue, lograremos volver a una cotidianidad. Antes y después de vacunarte, ponte la mascarilla sobre nariz y boca y mantén al menos 6 pies de distancia de personas que no vivan contigo. Desinféctate frecuentemente las manos con agua y con jabón o con alcohol 60% más. Evita las aglomeraciones de personas y los espacios públicos cerrados que no permiten que el aire circule. Y, si te juntas con personas, hazlo afuera o al aire libre. Busca maneras creativas y aprovecha la tecnología para conectar con tu gente, porque es distancia física, no social, en comunidad, con conocimiento y prevención. Así es que salimos de esta. Les boricuas tenemos 2 herramientas poderosas y sin iguales para vencer este reto: la ciencia y la solidaridad. Por ti, por tu familia, por tu comunidad y por Puerto Rico, practica las medidas preventivas. ¿Por qué? Porque aquí nos cuidamos.
This is a video of Aquí Nos Cuidamos, which is a COVID-19 prevention and mental health promotion project that I've been leading for the past 2 years in Puerto Rico. And we created more than 200 multimedia assets for this project, this video being one of them. And at the core of this project is Puerto Rican culture. It's really about connecting preventive measures for COVID-19 with our values. Community is really important for us in Puerto Rico. Solidarity is a strong community value. And in this video, we really underscore this. We're not only caring for yourself or like practicing preventive measures. You're not only getting vaccinated for you, you're doing it for your community, for your family. We're using language the way that the voice speaks. She's using words that we use every day, like bembe, which is a big boisterous party. It's an African word that's commonly used in Puerto Rico. The music has Puerto Rican instruments. We have a sign language interpreter that is prominently featured, not just as a way to make the content accessible to the deaf community, but also to make them feel seen. Usually when you see videos with an interpreter, they're this big in a corner. And we decided we're not gonna do that. They are going to be as important part of the video as the illustrations and the motion graphics. And so the way we built this video is really bringing together all of these values and messages that appeal to Puerto Rican identity. Another strategy that I want to highlight is that you can use culturally relevant science communication to engage communities. One of the things that we did with Aquí Nos Cuidamos is we worked really closely with community leaders from Puerto Rico, and particularly we recruited this group of 10 ambassadors who represent different communities, religious communities, the deaf community, people who live in public housing, women, and we work with them to support their community engagement efforts through trainings, through funding, and of course through this multimedia toolkit that they created. And so they became ambassadors of culturally relevant science communication. Here you see Sor Faustina, who did, she went to a bakery. Bakeries are really important in communities in Puerto Rico. It's where people go have their coffee, meet their neighbors. And so she set up a table about COVID vaccinations to respond to questions about COVID vaccines. We also have Jamilet, who is deaf. She organized testing events and delivery of protective equipment to deaf people in Western Puerto Rico. We also have Jessica, who organized vaccination events, and she got probably thousands of people vaccinated in her communities. We have Lucia, who you see in the center. She created like 40 banners like this one with pictures of people in her community with prevention messages so that people in her community could see themselves represented and to show their commitment to taking care of each other. And then finally, we had Loari, who is, she's a public health professional, and she led the restoration of a children's park in her community because she knew that people needed a low-risk space to get together safely after months of lockdown at the beginning of the pandemic. And then finally, I want to highlight language. This is Corey Gray and his mom, Sharon Yellowfly. They are both Blackfoot, of the First Nation Blackfoot Siksika. And Corey is a physicist. He worked at LIGO, or works at LIGO, which is this observatory. They have one in Louisiana. They have one in Eastern Washington state. And this facility discovered or detected gravitational waves a few years ago. This gravitational waves were these things that had been predicted by Einstein, precisely, 100 years ago, and they observed those gravitational waves, I think it was 2017. And Corey was one of the people that was in the room when they made that first observation. This was a huge deal when it happened, and so naturally there were press releases and press conferences, and they were translating the press releases into many different languages, and he thought, what if we translated this press release into the Blackfoot language? It's an endangered language. Because of colonialism, it was a language that was almost disappeared, but Sharon Yellowfly is one of the few people who still speaks this language. And so he worked with his mom to translate the press release, which you can see here. This was the first time that a major scientific discovery was translated into an indigenous language. And so Corey used his precision as a researcher. He was an important part of this discovery, and he advocated that with the translation of this press release, they could underscore the importance of native languages and native people in science. And I lied, I have one more. So this one, last one, is really about how you all can use culturally relevant science communication, how you can tap into your own culture, into your own identities, to step into the power of those and share your science and how who you are really informs the science that you do. So this is the last clip I'll show you, and this is from the series of videos I produced a few years ago called Background to Breakthrough.
I grew up in the Mission District of San Francisco, which at that time was a low-income neighborhood, primarily known for Latino culture, lots of African Americans. I was troubled and angry, and my dad liked to drink. And there was a very vibrant bar called Mission Rock, where there were a lot of fishermen. And up until about the age of 8, before my parents got divorced, I would go there every weekend, and I would fish while my dad drank. And I was fascinated with the water and the fish, and I was hooked right there for biology, and I knew that that's where I wanted to go. But in the mission at the time, there were a lot of racial challenges, and I would fight, and I got kicked out of my first high school. So I've been the tremendous beneficiary of mentorship. All my mentors were unique and very diverse. After the divorce, this Chinese family took me in, and they had 2 sons, and I fit right in between in age. I went to Chinese school. I learned a lot about Chinese culture. I had a high school wrestling coach mentor me and a whole network of other fatherless kids. In college, I had 2 great mentors. One was African American on the US 84 and 88 Olympic team, getting a PhD. At Stanford, the Jewish students, they gave me an opportunity to live at their house. So for 2 years, I was steeped in Jewish culture. They believed in me before I believed in myself. So the combination of all those experiences is really what shaped me, and it's really broadened my career in medicine. And I look at things and I try to empathize with different patients and try to stand in their shoes. And now I try to give back.
So this video is part of Background to Breakthrough. It is a series of short films that I produced a few years ago to highlight how scientists of color succeed because of their backgrounds and not in spite of. Often when we hear the stories of scientists of color, people from marginalized backgrounds, you hear about them from a deficit perspective. And I wanted to challenge that deficit perspective. And so this series features Esteban Gonzalez-Bouchard, who you just saw. He's a physician scientist studying health disparities in asthma at the University of California, San Francisco. It also features Rebecca Calisi Rodriguez, who is a neurobiologist at the University of California, Davis. And then finally, Manu Prakash, who is a bioengineer at Stanford University. And all of the videos are free online. You can watch them in that link, or if you just go on YouTube and search Background to Breakthrough, you can probably find them. All right, so let me summarize what I've shared with you today. Culturally relevant science communication connect science to the culture and realities of different publics. It can make science pertinent, more accessible, and actionable for those different publics. It helps improve their agency and their capacity, particularly of vulnerable communities, to leverage science to address their needs and their priorities. It makes people feel seen. It makes people feel reflected in stories. And then in telling those stories, we can help change perceptions of marginalized folks and scientists of color. Through culturally relevant science communication, we need awareness of culture, not just of the audience, but ourselves. It requires a recognition of inequities, of biases, or privileges. It also requires empathy, humility, and listening. And then finally, there are different strategies. I share different strategies with you. Those are just some examples. It's not just, there are many more. And so I encourage you to think about who's your audience, what is it that you want to achieve, what do you want to communicate, and then what are the culturally relevant strategies that are going to fit best for what you want to do. And so with that, I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to your questions.